Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, yes, hello, thanks for having me. So I'm going to share this afternoon some research we're carrying out at UCL on the theme of exploring disparities in the likelihood of promotion in the professional workforce by characteristics such as gender, ethnicity and socio-economic background. And I've been undertaking this alongside my colleagues Lindsay Macmillan and Claire Tyler. I'm going to go through relatively quick because I've got a fair bit to get through and I want to have a bit of question and discussions at the end. But I think, to some extent, the motivation kind of goes without saying. This is an important issue for us to understand. There's a relation here, of course, with existing research around the pay gap. So it's obviously very well documented that we have these pay gaps in the workforce related to characteristics such as gender, ethnicity and socio-economic background. And if there are gaps in rates of promotion by these characteristics, then there's an obvious connection between these two things. These are obviously going to be closely intertwined since the things of pay and promotion are themselves closely related. So if we can get a handle on inequalities in promotion likelihoods, that will throw more light on other inequalities relating to pay. But of course, I also think it's something that we should be aiming to understand in its own right as well. So this is a question of fairness ultimately, and we ought to be in a situation where there is no connection between these kinds of personal characteristics and the likelihood of promotion, and the only things that have a bearing on that likelihood are things like performance within the workplace or your level of experience and so forth. So this was an exercise, well this is an exercise rather, in secondary data analysis. So this is a quantitative piece of research. We've been very lucky in that we have been provided with some really good quality data from three different employers. So we've got hold of anonymised individual level data from three anonymous firms. So you can ask me anything at the end of this presentation except the identity of these firms, because we've agreed that we won't divulge them. But they are firms which are kind of employ graduate professionals, if you like. We merged the three data sets together into a single data set, and we had over 37,000 employees in that data set. And in terms of some of the different variables that we've got in the data set, obviously it includes these personal characteristics such as gender, ethnicity, and as a measure of socio-economic background, we've gone for school type, and I'll talk more about that later. We've used that because it was the only one that was consistently available across all of the three employers. I think we would have preferred to have used other variables. So Claire mentioned earlier the question that many employers ask of what type of job did your parents have when you were 14 years old? So a lot of employers are collecting that. We might have preferred to have used a variable like that, but it wasn't available across all the data sets. So we have used school type. We've also got in this data set a variable related to the level of seniority of the employees. And obviously it's kind of on a different scale at different companies, but we've collapsed this down into a 3-point scale of workers, managers or leaders. And if you're interested in the kind of rough proportion in terms of those categories, about 50% of the sample is in the worker category, 40% of the sample is in the manager category, leaving 10% of the sample in the leader category. Another nice variable we've got in the data set is a rating of some kind of performance rating of the employee provided by the employer. So this is typically a kind of result from like an annual appraisal cycle that the employers go through. And different firms do it in different ways and have a different scale. So we standardized these scores for each firm separately before we linked the data set together. So we got a kind of standardized performance score, which has a mean of 0, standard deviation of 1, as a kind of indication of the employee's current level of performance. We could also see in the data set details of recent promotions. So typically over like a 12-month period, for example, we could see whether employees had been promoted, what level they were starting at before the promotion, and what level they had been promoted to. And we also had loads of other contextual information about the employees. So this included things like their age, how long they had worked at the particular firm, whether they were working part-time or full-time, the particular department that they were working in within the firm, and also which region they were based in, because some of these companies are kind of large national companies who have offices in different parts of the UK. So we had loads of different variables in this data set that we could use. And the questions that we were really interested in was, focusing on these characteristics of gender, ethnicity, and school type as a measure of socioeconomic status. We've kind of gone through these three stages. Firstly, using the data set that we had, We could investigate the extent to which the workforce at these three firms was representative of the wider UK workforce, and we've made a comparison of national data using the labour force survey. And we could also see, firstly, how representation varied at different levels of seniority, and we definitely see variation in representation by different levels of seniority, as I will show you. Because we had that performance data, we could also investigate the extent to which employers were given different kind of performance rating on average to groups of employees with different characteristics. Because if they were doing that, that could be a potential driver of disparities in promotion likelihood. And then this leads on to this final point of, to what extent is the likelihood of promotion affected by these different characteristics? And what is it like when we look at it in a kind of raw sense, and then what is it like when we control for other factors statistically? So even if we take into consideration, for example, the fact that employers may be given more generous appraisal ratings to certain employees than others, or that some people may be more likely to work in certain parts of the country, and all of these things, once we take all of those factors into consideration, what are the gaps in promotion rates looking like? So here, this table gives an indication of the kind of completeness of the data set. So we were very lucky that we had complete data on gender, almost complete data on ethnicity. Things like school type attended is a trickier one, because obviously employers survey their employees and ask them to divulge these, or they ask them at the point when they recruit them, but not everyone responds. So we didn't have complete data on school type attended, but more than 3/4 of employers we knew their school type. A lot of these that are 100%, it's basically just because this data has been lifted straight from the HR system of the employer and shared with us, so they have complete data on all of these variables. One that's less complete is performance rating, where we had that for over 70% of employees. That's typically not complete because some newer employees have not quite been through that full appraisal cycle yet, so they haven't maybe even had their first performance rating. But we had a measure of performance for most of the employees in the sample. So I'll take you through now some of the analysis that we've undertaken, and I'll maybe go through this in 3 stages. So I'll start by sharing the data around the kind of representativeness of our workforce sample here compared to the wider population. Then we'll look at disparities in performance by different characteristics. Then we'll look at that final question of how the likelihood of promotion is varying according to these different characteristics. So I'll start with kind of workforce representation, and then within that we will look at gender. So we're comparing here figures from our sample of employees versus the wider workforce. So the bars on the left in pink and purple relate to our sample. So the one on the far left is kind of all of the sample, and it was a male heavy sample, so 57% of employees in the sample were male. That actually drops a bit to 56% when we just look at the manager and leader categories. The other 3 bars on the right, we've calculated those figures using the labour force survey. We've taken 5 years of the labour force survey from 2015 through to 2019. That was a deliberate decision there to stop at 2019. Some of you may be aware that at that point in time, the quality of the data in the labour force survey, unfortunately, has started to deteriorate. So we've got data here from 2015 to 2019. So we know, for example, that across the UK working age population, we have 53% of males and 47% of females. But because we're talking about sort of like graduate professional employees here, employers here, we wanted to get benchmarks for things like, graduate employees in management or professional roles. Now, it turns out for this period from 2015 to 2019, that is pretty much 50-50 now. So of all people in the workforce in management or professional roles, we have pretty much exactly 50% male, 50% female, according to the labour force survey. But of course, the lesson here is that women are underrepresented, both as a whole, and if we kind of compare against that graduates in management or professional roles. We can also see how it varies according to level of seniority. So we kind of have more than 50% males in all of the categories. The highest proportion of females is actually in the manager category, but we get a very sharp drop in the proportion of females as we get up to this leader category, which was the 10% of most senior staff, with about 2/3 of all staff in that leader category being male. As for ethnicity, we can do something similar where we compare against benchmarks from the labour force survey. So when we did this, we found that it was not the case that ethnic minority staff as a whole were underrepresented at these firms. In fact, if anything, statistically they were perhaps slightly overrepresented, and the white group was underrepresented in a statistical sense. We see as well that the Asian group was very well represented in the sense that 20% of our sample was Asian, and it's about 9% of all graduate employees in management or professional roles were Asian. Having said this, we see again this big drop-off when we get to the leader category here. So whilst about 70% of the workers were white, that goes up to 85% for leaders. And if you look at that Asian bar at the end, for example, that's 21% for both workers and managers, and then kind of drops in half to 10% as we get to the leader category. Now there could be different things going on here. So age is a factor here. Broadly speaking, this leader category is going to be the oldest, and amongst older cohorts of workers, there is less ethnic diversity. However, some of the results I will share with you later on suggest that that is not the only thing that is going on, and that there could be barriers to promotion for members of certain ethnic minority groups. Finally, we can look at this issue of school type and seniority. And I should explain at this point how we have categorised the employees according to school type. So we've used three categories, which is those in state-funded schools, those in independent schools, i.e. private fee-paying schools, and those in international schools, i.e. people who are educated outside of the UK. The state category is quite broad in that it could includes all state-funded schools, so that could include things like selective grammar schools, but most of the employees in there have probably attended state comprehensive schools. And one pattern we can maybe see here is that, again, it's always interesting to observe the patterns in this leader category, where we get quite a sudden uptick there in the proportion of employees who attended independent schools when they were younger. We don't have any benchmarks here from the labour force survey because it's not really easy to calculate those. It would be easier to calculate them on that other issue I mentioned of kind of parents' job when you were age 14. But as I say, we weren't able to get that from the employer data. So that's the kind of impression of the sort of representativeness of the sample compared to the wider UK workforce. We then move on to the issue of average performance ratings that are kind of awarded by employers to the employees, and how this breaks down by different characteristics. So as I say, these were standardised at each firm level with a mean of 0 before they were brought together. So we can see that there aren't huge differences by gender, although if anything, employers seem to be awarding slightly higher performance grades to female staff than male staff. There are larger gaps by ethnicity. So those of white ethnicity are getting the highest performance ratings on average, and those of black ethnicity are getting the lowest performance ratings on average. In terms of how it varies by school type, we've got slightly positive figures for those from state schools. The highest one is from independent schools there, and a below average figure for those who've attended international schools. Now, I'm certainly not saying, we're not saying with this data that this genuinely means that certain groups of employees are performing worse than others. There's lots of things which could explain these disparities, such as bias in the appraisal process, or certain groups of employees not being given as much support as they need, or facing barriers and so on. So there's lots of possible explanations as to these disparities, but these were the average disparities that we observed in the kind of performance grades that the employers were awarding to the employees in their kind of annual performance reviews. So this leads us on next then to this central issue of the likelihood of promotion by different characteristics. So the way we did this in the data set is we kind of take each employee and we establish whether or not they have been promoted within a given kind of 12-month observation window. We had to vary slightly the particular timing of that window from one employer to the other because of the way the data set worked, but that window was always either in the year 2022 and or 2023. We could consider two types of promotions because, as I said, we've got these three categories of worker, manager, and leader. So we can consider promotions from the worker category to the manager category, or promotions from the manager category to the leader category. Those were the two promotions that we could consider. But we also had to decide whether a given employee was kind of eligible for that promotion. So for manager promotions, we wanted to establish, who was kind of in the pool of people who could possibly be promoted to manager, which was a harder exercise than we first thought. But to put it as simply as possible, it basically involves identifying any of those who were workers at the start of the observation window who might then have got promoted. Some of them did and some of them didn't. And out of about 20,000 people in that pool at the start of the observation window, most did not get promoted, about 1,500 did, which was about 7% of that pool. The pool is smaller for leader, so that would be all of the people who were working as a manager at the start of the window. And there were about 14,000 of those, and then only 334 of those were promoted to leader during that window, which is just 2.3%. So from a technical perspective in terms of the methodology that we're using here, so we can look at kind of raw descriptives in terms of who's promoted and who's not, but then when we step it up a gear by adding statistical controls, we're using a linear regression method, specifically a probit method, which is a kind of method we use to predict these binary outcomes where either you do get promoted or you don't get promoted. So it's kind of predicting that binary outcome based on all of the different variables that we've got. Like I say, we do this in a kind of raw sense, and then we also say what happens when we control statistically for all of these other average differences between groups. And here's a summary of the other things that we are controlling for when we use those statistical controls. So when we consider gender, for example, we can also control for the other personal characteristics, i.e. ethnicity and school type. We can control for which of the three firms that they're working for, and then which department within those firms that they're working for, because we did see variation in promotion likelihood by department. Obviously, performance rating is a really interesting one to control for. We might expect that people who are performing better are more likely to be promoted, for example. We could control for age, we could control for length of service of working at the firm, whether someone is working part-time or full-time, and as I said earlier, which kind of region of the country that employees are working in, because they can, these are often firms where there's different branches, and we can take that into consideration. So I'll give you a moment to take this first graph in while I have a sip of water. So I'll go through 4 slides of results here. I'm starting with raw differences in likelihood of promotion to manager. So this was all of those in the pool of people who might be promoted to manager, and then seeing whether they were. So the first thing I should say about these graphs is every kind of line on this graph here is relative to something else. So this laser's not quite working. But female is relative to male. The ethnicity categories are kind of benchmark against white ethnicity. So we've got Asian versus white, black versus white, mixed ethnicity versus white, other ethnicity versus white. And then the school bars are benchmarked against state school. So this is independent school against state school and international school against state school. Along this x-axis at the bottom here, we've got a percentage point difference in probabilities. Now this first needs to be multiplied by 100, so this is a kind of 2.5 percentage points here. This is minus 2.5 percentage points here. And we've got a 90% confidence interval as well. So we don't see a big difference in likelihood of promotion to manager by gender. But then once we start to get into ethnicity, we do see, for example, a gap in the kind of black versus white for ethnicity. And this is looking roughly at about kind of 3.5% here. Okay, so we see this sort of 3.5% percentage point difference in the probability of promotion between white employees and black employees. We see slight differences by ethnicity here, but the kind of tails here are showing that they're not statistically significant. So the grey bars are not significant and the black bars are. But we also see for those from independent schools who studied at independent schools that they're about 2.5 percentage points more likely to be promoted than those who have attended state schools. On the next slide, I'm going to throw in all of those statistical controls that I mentioned previously. So this is taking into consideration things such as known differences in the appraisal ratings. Are you working full-time, part-time? Are you working in London or in some other region? And so on. So taking all of those different factors into consideration, we saw, if I just flip back then, so we see actually that independent school category has now gone to non-significant, although it is still positive, although the category for black ethnicity there is remaining statistically significant in comparison to the white category. So we still see that disparity persisting once we control for those other variables. The next slide I'll show you will be the raw differences for manager to leader promotions. So these were raw differences in likelihood of promotion to leader. Again, we're not seeing much for gender there. For ethnicity, as well as seeing a difference there for black ethnicity versus white ethnicity, we're also seeing a big gap there for Asian ethnicity versus white ethnicity. If you remember back to one of those previous slides, we saw that the proportion of Asian workers kind of halved as we went from the manager category to the leader category. We've also got a significant gap here for those in international schools versus those in state schools. The next slide, where I throw in the controls for likelihood of promotion to leader, doesn't change much. So some of the magnitude of these might have shifted. In fact, it's probably not helpful that these graphs are on slightly different, oh no, I think they're on the same scale. But we still see these significant gaps, one there at Asian ethnicity, one at black ethnicity, and one at international school. I've also got a final slide here of these results, like summarising some of these trends. And we've done two things here. So firstly, we've left the cells empty there when the gap was not statistically significant, and then the cell is populated when it is statistically significant. Secondly, we've done a slight shift in terms of the percentages here. So this is looking at it in a proportional sense rather than looking at it in a percentage point sense. And I can explain that very simply by giving an example of, so if we suppose, for example, that in terms of promotion to manager, we saw that 6% of all white staff were promoted to manager, but only 3% of all black staff were promoted to manager. That is a 3 percentage points difference, right? But it's actually a huge difference in a proportional sense, because if you've got a 6% chance of promotion, that's double the chance of promotion compared to if you've only got a 3% chance of promotion. So what can be small percentage point differences in likelihood can actually be really big differences when we look at it in a proportional way. So these percentages are dealing with it in a proportional sense, and we see some quite big percentages here when we look at this in terms of proportional likelihood of promotion for some of these different characteristics. So before I go to some kind of final thoughts, we've also flagged up here a few things that we kind of stumbled across on the way, if you like. So the main things we were interested in were those personal characteristics: gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. But once you start to control for things statistically, once we control for full-time versus part-time, that is showing us what is the consequence of being part-time as opposed to full-time in terms of your likelihood of promotion. So other things we kind of discovered along the way was that we didn't find that length of service did not have a bearing on the likelihood of promotion, but we did find that age did have a slight effect. So being a little bit older did slightly reduce the likelihood of promotion, all else being equal. If you're interested in more details of this and kind of more numbers, we are putting together a working paper. I know there's not kind of, I haven't quantified this, but these are some other trends that we've observed. Perhaps unsurprisingly, working part-time, all else being equal, does appear to reduce the likelihood of being promoted. Also, perhaps unsurprisingly, those who work in London seem to have the highest likelihood of promotion compared to otherwise equivalent employees who work in other branch offices. We're not claiming that any of this is causal, so there could be something about the kinds of employees who are selecting into those offices in London. The kinds of people who are choosing to live and work in London might be different on average in some way that we can't observe. But we did notice that working in London seemed to increase the likelihood of promotion. We did also find, I guess, what was encouraging, that the relationship between promotion likelihood and performance was what we would kind of expect and hope, that there was a positive relationship. It was the case that higher performing workers were more likely to be promoted than lower performing ones, but the gap certainly wasn't as big as I was expecting. So performance, as measured in these appraisal ratings, certainly isn't the be-all and end-all in terms of determining the likelihood of promotion. So a few thoughts, a summary and a few thoughts to finish. So we did find that women were underrepresented in the sample, especially in more leadership roles. Ethnic minority staff were well represented on the whole, but they were more likely to be found outside of those leadership roles. Those who attended independent schools were well represented in leadership roles, and those who attended international schools were not. And we did find that performance ratings varied by personal characteristics, and lower ratings were typically awarded to men, staff from ethnic minority backgrounds, and those who attended international schools. For promotions, we didn't find a statistically significant disparity when we looked at gender, either before or after controls were applied, but we did find significant disparities when we looked at ethnicity. Black staff were considerably less likely to be promoted to manager and leader, and Asian staff were less likely to be promoted to leadership positions. Staff who attended independent schools were more likely to be promoted to manager, and those who attended international schools were less likely to be promoted to leader. What does this all mean? So we think we would suggest that work should continue to improve the representation of women and staff from ethnic minority backgrounds in leadership positions. Firms should ensure that appraisal processes are fair and supportive for all staff, especially those from ethnic minority backgrounds and those who attended from international schools. They may want to investigate their own performance data to see whether these gaps are there and try and understand why different groups of staff seem to be awarded different ratings. We think firms should ensure that black staff especially are supported to achieve their full potential in the workplace, and that they should investigate why certain groups of staff, such as those from ethnic minority backgrounds, am I repeating myself there? I don't think so. Maybe likely to, sorry, there's a lot here, isn't there? Maybe less likely to achieve a promotion even at the same level of performance. And also we don't, so you know, other firms could be different to the ones that we've included in our sample, but firms, you know, should investigate some of these things which they can do with their own data. Is it the case that part-time workers, all else being equal, are less likely to be promoted than those who are working full-time? Is it the case that those in London are more likely to be promoted? If that is the case, do we want that to be the case? And what can we do about that to change that? As I say, there's one question you can't ask me, but only one, and I'm happy to take any other questions. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. This was really interesting and insightful. I was just wondering, because you've been looking at gender, but you mainly you've only been looking at men and women.
Yes.
Is there any data on gender minority groups, like transgender or non-binary people?
No, we don't have it in this sample, I'm afraid. So it's something we could consider. Obviously, yeah, it will depend on how the particular employers are kind of collecting and recording the data. But yeah, it wasn't possible to do that for this particular data set, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, I work for Viva. I think, like most companies, we focus on gender and ethnicity separately. So, gender pay gap, ethnicity pay gap, and kind of continue to monitor those separately. Do you think and that seems quite representative of firms as a whole. Do you think that's actually driven some of the results you're seeing? Because if you only focus on gender, for example, you may be more likely to promote white women over black and Asian women. If you focus on ethnicity, you might be more likely to promote Asian people over black people, and not look at the nuances between different ethnicities and intersectionality between, intersectionality between gender and ethnicity. And consequently, do you think black men, for example, are underrepresented in leadership roles and in workplace in general because they don't get talked about, because they're kind of at a opposition in those two?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. I mean, I guess a couple of thoughts then. Number one, I guess like none of these things should be mutually exclusive. So I think, yeah, we want to focus on all of these things. So we want to address the gender pay gap. We want to address the ethnicity pay gap. But yeah, you've touched on something there that I have often thought. So, I mean, we've done some other analyses where we have looked at things like the connection between ethnicity and pay. And so one lesson that I've learned from doing that is I definitely think it's a mistake to have these simplistic divides of kind of like white versus like BAME. And I have seen some companies, because there seems to be a conversation about whether like ethnicity pay reporting should be mandatory. I think the current government are saying it should be. Some companies have started doing it voluntarily, but I have seen some companies who do it in that kind of white versus BAME fashion. And I think, yes, that can obscure what could be some considerable disparities between groups within that kind of big BAME umbrella. So I guess, yeah, I think number one, we should focus on all of these things. But yeah, I do think when we're looking at ethnicity, whether we're focusing on promotions, whether we're focusing on pay, then yes, I mean, there's always a debate around kind of how far you kind of cut it. So, you know, when we're doing research with very large data sets, so I do some research with the very large education data sets, where you've got hundreds of thousands like per cohort, and you can break ethnicity down not just into kind of white, black, Asian. You can go to kind of like black Caribbean, black African, Indian, Pakistani, and those kind of splits can be revealing as well. As the numbers in data sets get a little bit smaller, that gets harder to do, and the underlying data might not be there as well. So I think often at the firm level, like I would advise going for that, what is often known as the kind of major ethnic groups, isn't it, of the kind of white, Asian, black, mixed, and other. So I don't think that white versus BAME or any other term that you might use is always revealing, and yeah, I think could hide certain inequalities. Does that answer it? Sorry, that was a bit meandering.
I think so. It's just, is the way we report things actually driven inequalities?
So is...
Actually driven inequalities.
Oh, right. So are there certain incentives that kind of lead to...
Results show that actually black ethnicity are less like people are less likely to get promoted if I'm reading it correctly.
Yeah.
But is it because of the way that we were actually doing DE9 in the workplace that's actually kind of almost driven that outcome?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I would hope not. But yeah, I think yeah, we need to keep addressing all of these issues, don't we? Like, yeah, hopefully there hasn't been any unintended consequences of other DEI initiatives.
We're gradually moving away from that idea that diversity is just about gender and ethnicity. I think that is happening, but it's progress.
Yeah, yeah.
Just on the back of that, do you have any plans on looking into the intersectional relationship? So, like, it's 50% less likely that a black ethnic staff member would get a promotion, but have you looked into, are there any plans in looking into whether a female black colleague would be promoted?
Yeah, so we have done some of these kind of, because I mean we've done different types of analyses. So we have also done individual analyses for individual firms, which we tend to then is kind of be internal for that firm. There have been times where we have looked at it at an intersectional level, and it has yielded some interesting results. One challenge we have is depending on the size of the sample and then how many different categories that you use. So we've done some intersectional analysis before where we kind of look at intersections of gender, ethnicity, and socioeconomic background. Now, I think in those cases we have done ethnicity as a kind of binary of white and BAME or ethnic minority. I'm just trying to do the numbers off the top of my head. Even then, you kind of get to sort of 12 different categories. There's like 12 different permutations if you just do male, female, white, non-white, and then 3 different socioeconomic categories throws up 12 categories. If you have a sample that isn't huge, the smallest of that category, of those categories, will itself be very small. Then you start putting those into statistical models. So it's always that balance of kind of like how far, I mean, it goes back to what I was saying about ethnicity in a way. You could go from black to black Caribbean and black African and this. So there's always that debate about how much far do you slice it up, how small do the numbers get, and then once the numbers get too small, you also find as well that when it comes to, you know, things like statistical significance, the smaller your groups are, the more likely you're going to get a grey bar here rather than a black bar. Because
that's why I thought other ethnicity is probably so wide because you.
Yes,
yeah.
exactly. Yeah, I mean, yeah. So that's a huge range, isn't it? Yeah, but yeah. So it's always that balance that we're trying to strike. Am I doing okay for time?
2 more questions.
2 more.
Just a quick point on the are we reporting? Is the way we're reporting leading to inequality? I guess if people aren't providing data, one thing that we've got to do is get people to provide the data, because of course, you know, they have to self-identify. That could be potentially one issue. Anyway, my question was really about the London effect. So did you say that you were able to say people living and working in London, or is it just working in London?
Ooh, so we don't know where people live. So all we know is kind of like, which office. So in their kind of HR system, one variable is like which office is this employee based
so
at?
It's the location.
Yeah, so it's possible that they. So I guess we could reasonably assume that they probably live within London or within commuting distance of London, depending on how often they have to go in and things
but
like
that
that.
could be quite a big distance, couldn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. We
But
know
yeah.
a lot of people living in the southwest but commuting
Yes.
to London.
but yeah, so it did surprise. That was one that kind of surprised me by how there were some that surprised me by how small the effect was, like performance, and then some that surprised me how big it was. Like, so living in London kind of had a bigger effect.
Did you tell us what the business? I know you said you can't say who the company is. Did you tell us what the business was in the beginning? I might have missed it. The nature of
It's not one. Yeah, so it's kind of we look for firms that employ kind of graduates, professionals.
Okay.
It's not necessarily the same one.
So assuming it's lower consultancy or something,
Oh, yeah.
it would be interesting to get data on utilisation and sales, right?
Yes.
So, because obviously if I'm selling something or if I'm billing hours, being in London, I'm just going to be able to do more. I mean, it's slowly changing, but it's very, very slow. Because the only reason I ask you this is because I just worry that if it is a sale billable hours type company, that you have really good black talent coming into this company and they're not being given the experience straight off the bat, they're not being introduced to clients, they're not being brought out, and that's what's causing the big huge effect here.
Yeah.
And that's what's causing the big huge effect. And so I think if you can get the tangible data, and also utilization of the colleagues themselves, like when are they getting to go out, who are they being networked with?
Yeah.
That kind of solves a bit of the problem that this company is bringing in talent and not growing it.
Yeah. No, I think that'd be really worthwhile. Yeah. Should we, one more then?
Okay,
Helen.
I was just wondering if, apologies if I misunderstood it, but are you able to, or will you in future, look at the likelihood of people wanting to apply for a promotion? Like, are the people who aren't getting it because they're not even applying in the first place, or they're being rejected?
Yeah, so I guess it all depends on what variables we have in the data set, and so what data the firm are collecting, and what they're able to share with us. So yeah, as it stands, we don't have any data on whether someone wants, or whether I guess whether someone wants to be promoted, they've got to be asked, haven't they? It's possible that you've just got to ask them. I guess some firms ought to have data on unsuccessful applications. That will probably be one of the next things we could get. So if we could see, that reminds me of, like, because some other research I do on the theme of access to university, we're always asking that question of, if poorer people aren't getting into university, is it because they're not applying, or do they not get in despite the fact that they do apply? Yeah. So I guess it's that same parallel here, isn't it? Like, if people aren't getting promoted, is it because they don't apply, or do they not? And then there's a different solution in either case. So if they're not applying, it might be that they need more encouragement to apply. If they are applying and are not succeeding, then again, I mean, Claire may know better than I think, like, obviously Lindsay and Claire Tyler have kind of done some similar research on that theme, haven't they? But it's more looking at entering into a firm to begin with rather than progressing through a firm. Is that a fair assumption?
In kind of complementary work, colleagues have done, they've looked at all applicants to not exactly the same firms, but similar types of firms. So I think there they found that actually the pool of people applying was really quite representative of the wider graduate population. And then every step you kind of went along the path towards actually getting a job. It's the same kind of leaky pipeline idea I was mentioning earlier. Different groups kind of drop off. And I think that's the research where Paul was mentioning, where they have looked a lot at intersectionality. And I'm not going to be able to remember their results off the top of my head, apologies, but we can definitely share links with people afterwards if they're interested. But I think there were definitely kind of groups kind of characterised across gender and ethnicity background who were seeing very big differences compared to others. So yeah, we can definitely share that if that's an interest to people.
Was there one more? Yeah.
Forgive me, because I worked for one of the organisations which you did this on our own, so I've seen some amazing rich research, but one of the hunches we had about one of the gaps was work allocation. So following on, I guess, from utilisation, but like access to high priority clients, how that's impacted by the networking people do, the sponsorships they have, and we just couldn't think of a way of any proxy to establish that data. I wonder if you've had any conversations with businesses who can kind of start to think about how you would measure that kind of access to levels of work.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, it all depends on what data they collect, and if they don't collect the data, there's no chance. But of course, employers can start collecting the data with a plan to, like, we know that then after a few years of collecting this, it will pay dividends because we can do some interesting analysis. I think, yeah, in cases where we've done stuff for individual firms, and when we're linking the data sets together as well, you've always got to look for variables which are kind of like common to all of them. I think we've done individual analyses for individual companies before. One variable we've looked at, which I think was quite revealing, was just a variable of whether someone is in more of like a kind of client-facing type of role versus whether someone is in more of like a back office support administrative role. And some of those roles are still relatively high paid, depending on what it is that they do. They're not necessarily all low paid roles, but there's that kind of distinction between, are you out there chasing the customers, and some months or years you're doing a bit better than others, or are you just you're just getting this regular salary every year because you're sat in the office doing performing a certain function that's very consistent and not related to chasing clients all the time. So yeah, that's one variable we've looked at. But yeah, in these kind of merging data sets together, it's always got to be trying to find the things that link across all of them. Next, I think.